welcome to a live streaming directly from the Munich Security Conference from the Bayerische Hof. My name is Zoé von Finck. I'm the podcast host of Ich bin so frei, which translates into I'm taking the liberty. It's a podcast that focuses on freedom, women, and how to shape our future in a meaningful way. Most of the time, I interview women in their areas of expertise. So today I'm delighted to be surrounded by two very knowledgeable experts. On my right is Katharina Schüller. She's an expert on data analytics and digitalization, as well as the founder of the company StudUp, which she founded already 20 years ago. She's also a best-selling author. Check out her new book. She has carried out over 500 data science projects, many of them for DAX companies, and Katharina conducts research on data literacy, data ethics, and data culture. She's also a member of various advisory boards in business and politics. And fun fact about Katharina, guess what? She does obstacles races for fun. So on my left, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Florence Gaub, who is currently Special Advisor to the EU's Foresight Commissioner, Maros Sefcovic. Previously, she was Deputy Director at the EU Institute of Security Studies and researcher at the NATO Defense College. Her career has taken her from conflict and war in the Middle East and North Africa to institutional change and geopolitical shifts. In 2019, she penned the Global Trends to 2030 report for the European Union's Foresight Network. In her work, she focuses on long-term trends, challenges and opportunities, and how to future-proof societies for them. Fun fact, she's a surfer. So if you want to hear more about these two ladies individually, they've already been guests to the podcast, so look out for episode 28 and 29. So today we're going to discuss from a European perspective, did we lose Africa? And what if we use data to win the battle of ideas? This is the first event of this kind, and obviously we would like to continue this discussion with our African friends who are, as we speaking, getting ready for the African Union Summit. I'm going to ask both a couple of questions and then take questions from the audience. So if your question is being picked, you can win these wonderful mugs, and I will send them to you right away. Contact me on LinkedIn for that. So why is this subject important? Let me name you three reasons. One is the battle of ideas. Number two is military predominance on the African continent. And number three, economic dominance. Let me go into a little bit of detail. It all started with the votes in spring 2022 at the UN General Assembly, where many Africans abstained on condemning the war on Ukraine. And this was a moment that really came as a shock to many Europeans that were confronted with hard truth about the state of their relations with Africa and the support of the so-called global order. Since then, Russian propaganda on social media in Africa has increased rapidly. In addition, Chinese digital Silk Road projects ranging from smart cities and building the 3G and 4G networks in Africa are already paying off, as China argues that the existing model of an open internet is inadequate to deal with societal challenges. So you can really see that Africa has become a key battleground between the two competing visions of internet governance. Number two, military predominance on the African continent. In the Sahel region in particular, increasingly you can see that Western engagement is no longer welcome. Instead, Russian mercenaries who simply get the job done are gaining ground, as well as in other African states. China also places great significance on stronger strategic focus in African countries and has built up military bases and military focus around the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden, including Djibouti. Number 3, economic dominance. Chinese economic activities include lending for infrastructure, construction by Chinese companies, and resource extraction by Chinese mining and energy firms. And as a result, many Western companies are already reconsidering their engagement in Africa and analyzing what grounds have been lost. So, to my two panelists, have we lost African hearts and minds to China and Russia already? And does it matter? And should it force US and European policymakers to rethink current strategies? So, Katharina, did we really lose Africa, or did we ever have Africa before?
This is an excellent question, and what it states is common misunderstanding about data science. Data science does not start with data, but it starts with a question, and it's really important to translate such a question into data, into the adequate data sets and models. So I have taken a look at 2 different data sets that could perhaps reflect whether we lost Africa, whether we ever had it. The first one is more or less about values. It's about democracy. You can see it in the first chart that I brought with me. This is the liberal democracy indicator taken from VDEM. And what you can see is that in the 80s, it was quite low. So democracy on average in African countries was measured really low. And then it increased until the 90s, 2000s. And then the curve started to flatten. And we might see a small trend going downwards now. I mean, it's too uncertain to really say we have democracy going down in Africa, but this could be one of our first indicators. And the second indicator that I had a look in is some that you already talked about. It's in my second chart that I brought with me, and it's about the votes at the UN General Assemblies. And what you can see is the lower the line is, the more it is to the bottom, the more the votes were in favor with China. So African states voted as China voted. The more they are to the top of the chart, the more they voted in favor with the United States. So you can see it's a cyclical curve, and it went up, then it went down, and then it started going up, and then now it's going down again. But what's even more important than the direction of the line is that you can see a clustering starting in 2006, 2007, where African countries started to vote more together, perhaps in favor of China.
Do you think there's a political reasoning for that from a political scientist's perspective?
Obviously, my job would be to interpret with Katharina what she's looking at. I think we would look at history to see is there an element or several elements, trends that brought this about. Well, obviously, we're in Munich right now. 2007, Putin's famous Munich speech, where he accused the United States of essentially neo-imperialism. So we could read this chart in that way, but I also saw a significant change in the chart after 2013, actually 2015 more, but Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, so you can expect some lag between the decisions taken and then the effects on the diplomatic level. China has been extremely active under Xi Jinping, playing diplomacy by the numbers, meaning they really go to every single state, no matter the size, and try to build relations in order to have the result, I think, that Katharina just showed. So I think these data show a reflection of a geopolitical trend that from a qualitative point of view, we could definitely find reasons for.
Let me take a step back and go back to the data. What data is even available, or what data did you use?
Oh, I had a variety of data that was available, and I think I looked at 24 different data sets, and they are of a different quality. So we can have a look at survey data. There's, for example, the Afrobarometer, where citizens of a country are surveyed about their opinions. Then we can have data on former voting behavior, which was in the last slide. So perhaps what country did in the past is a predictor of what it will do in the future. And finally, there is something that we could call hard facts, but in fact they are not so hard. It's like debt, or it's like foreign direct investments and so on, or military presence, weapon delivery and so on. But there are measurement errors. We do not know those data exactly, and this is often forgotten just because you can quantify. It does not mean that there is no uncertainty in these data. And the interesting thing is that you need to combine all of them. Each of them could be a tiny piece of the puzzle, and if you combine them, then suddenly you see the big picture.
So you mean that if I'm saying that data from survey might not be so valuable, I would rather like to look at like hard facts, like military spending or foreign direct investment, where I would think, where I had the assumption that this is more, it's a more valuable data. You're disputing this and saying, no, you're not so sure.
I wouldn't be so sure, no. Let me give you an example. For example, what we can see is that there is a correlation between the perception of the influence of China and the influence of Russia, which you can clearly see in the data. But this is not the only thing. What you also can see is that this correlation depends on the reason why the Chinese influence was seen positive. It could be seen positive, and this is what the majority in some countries state, that it's because Chinese investment in infrastructure or also in business. And in other countries, the majority states that it's because of China's political influence, that they support a country in foreign policy, but they keep themselves out of domestic policy issues.
We started this debate looking at the votes at the General Assembly that focused on Ukraine and Russia. Were there any other findings that could that correlates with the votes in the General Assembly? What did you find?
Yes, there were a lot of interesting patterns that I found, and to make it clear, none of them states that it's a causal relation. I will get to that in a minute, but let me first have a look at our first chart that I brought with me. This is a so-called self-organizing map. That's the method that was used. I used a tool called Discovery. It's very visual, and what you can see here is you have 4 clusters, and those clusters are predictions of the vote in the last UN General Assembly regarding the Ukraine conflict. And the predictions are yes, abstain, or no. And we have 2 different clusters of countries. That means countries that are similar in certain characteristics that were predicted to vote yes, 1 cluster that was predicted to vote abstain, and 1 cluster that was predicted to vote no. And the colors show you the observed votes. So red are the countries that voted with a yes, green are the countries that voted abstain, and no is the blue. The blue countries were those that voted with no. And you see that the clusters are quite a good prediction of what really happened. And it's based on a variety of different data. If we can go to the next chart, this shows you how good the former voting behavior was in predicting. So this was one of the votes in one General Assembly, and it's very good in predicting the yes. So the red ones are almost completely within the 2 yes clusters. If we go to the next one, this was another vote, another General Assembly, and this is quite bad at predicting the yeses, but it's very good at predicting the no. So if we combine them, it's already very close to what really happened in reality. And it's perhaps, as I said, not causality, but it's a good predictor. Yeah, you want to say?
No, because I mean, you say that this doesn't show you causality, but I think when you add the qualitative analysis, you do see that, for instance, the active things China and Russia have done to, build relationships, I'm going to say, with Africa, they do pay off, right? Because what your data shows, there's a pattern that is so consistent that you can actually make a prediction.
And this is... I mean, we got those votes only recently, so the question is, could we have an earlier indicator of that? And this is something which you can see in my next chart that I brought with me. It also shows the real voting behavior, but combined with another indicator, and that indicator, this was the relation to China. And it shows you whether the influence of China was seen rather positive or rather negative in the country. What you see, the blue ones are those where the majority of citizens said the influence of China is rather negative, and the red ones is where they say it's rather positive. And you see there's a correlation between seeing China as positive and voting no. Well, it's not that clear as it was in the one with the votes, but we have the data. It's from 2019. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that if you combine this data with another sort of data, which is the democracy index, it's the democracy index given by The Economist, you see that it distinguishes between no and yes. Also not completely, so the red ones have a higher democracy index and the blue ones have a lower democracy index. But if you combine it with the perception of the Chinese influence, then suddenly the picture gets much clearer and you can see those indicators, you can get them from 2-3 years before, and there could be a causal relationship. I don't know if it's causal, because this is nothing you can prove with data, but they have a predictive power for what a country will do in the UN General Assembly.
Do you have any other findings that you would like to share at this point? Or otherwise, I would like to...
Do we have a specific
well,
question?
I think I want to bounce off on what you said, because actually what your data suggests to the question, what your answer is to the question of have we lost it, it says yes, but it's been a while. So maybe what's new is that Europeans wake up to this fact, because you have data showing that this is a consistent trend that's more or less a decade old. So I'm wondering, why are we not making more use of this type of predictive modeling when, you know, we have the data, we have you.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is there's a lot of myths, and if you can use data, then maybe some of the experts would lose their influence. This is perhaps one reason, that you don't need experts that only rely on their experience. And on the other hand, it's a certain mindset to use data and also to understand what data can tell you and what data can't tell you. So you have to distinguish between data and the meaning of data, and that's why it needs a cooperation between experts like you and experts like me. For example, you mentioned that you always thought it's the hard facts and we should not look at survey data. What I found when I did this analysis is that hard facts that I used, like military presence or debt or FDI, didn't distinguish that clear between the yes and no as it was in the soft facts.
Interesting. I also like the idea that, you know, that this might threaten experts who look at the past, because we're more in demand of experts who look at data and also at experts who look at the future. So Florence, on your daily basis, you've been doing foresight for years. So what data do you use? What are the tools you're using, and what factors matter? And to what extent is foresight actually used today? Does it matter?
Never enough is the answer to your last question. No, I think there is an artificial war going on between the qualitative and quantitative experts. It's artificial because in reality, I, for instance, have always relied on all data I can get. So it's as much Katharina's work as, you know, you need to be creative in foresight because you're talking about something that doesn't exist yet, the future. So you can use science fiction, but not science fiction, just the odd film. But there are people that use aggregated data from science fiction to find patterns. You know, we know that there is data showing that the theme of a war in Ukraine opposing Russia to the West emerges regularly through Russian science fiction since the 1990s. So we can use this kind of data, but of course also qualitative things. There's also, for instance, a very interesting project called Cassandra that looks at trends in literature. Can you use literature as a conflict predictor in a sense? So, you know, I'm completely non-discriminatory when it comes to all kinds of information. I want everything. And I'm particularly interested in working with people like Katharina because we're not doing it enough. I think there is still a strong bias in social sciences, so by extension anything political, when it comes to data, because we think this is the hard stuff, and you know, we are in the mysterious realm of human behavior that nobody really understands. So we've been fighting a war actually in the EU to advance the use of data. I can't say we've gotten very far, but you know, I think the journey is definitely going in that direction because it's such a great tool to see patterns that experts simply cannot see because they cannot digest the numbers, the quantities in the way that Katharina's model can.
I mean, many are saying that we should use more prevention, you know, that, you know, rather than working on a daily basis going from crisis to crisis, we need to devote more time to look into the future, to anticipate what is coming. So how is your reaction within, policymakers when you're saying, hey, I know what's going to happen, or I might know what's going to happen? How is the reaction overall?
So this is a consistent problem we have as foresighters. So it's not just me. I'm in an excellent company, but we all have very similar problems. The first is that you all know the numerous decision makers that claim after an event that nobody saw it coming. And what they're actually saying is, I didn't see it coming. Because there's always somebody in the system, be it the war in Ukraine, be it the Arab Spring, be it the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is an interesting myth, for instance, that the CIA didn't see the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a complete lie. They did. But because I think Reagan said the reports indicating a collapse of the Soviet Union were not forceful enough, he just didn't believe them. So we have a lot of personal biases against news that contradict the status quo. That's because human beings have, I call it a high probability bias, because tomorrow it will be a lot like today. In most of cases, tomorrow will be a lot like today. So our train is constantly on the, tomorrow will be more like today tracks. And then I come in and say, it might go left or right. And nobody really wants to hear that. So the real issue we have is not so much finding the information, finding plausible causalities that could lead us in a certain direction. It's actually passing the message to the decision makers, finding decision makers that are happy to challenge themselves. So I think the real issue is institutional. It's not, which a lot of people think, finding the holy grail of, that one event, that one surprising thing that nobody else saw coming. No, it's really an institutional, psychological, bureaucratic even issue that we all face.
And what could be done about it, actually, to shake people or to make sure that these people who see these things are actually being heard?
So there are some ideas. First of all, so at the beginning I thought everybody has to do foresight all the time when I started out with this job. Then I realized, no, bureaucracy can't work like that, because bureaucracy has to be on its regular day-to-day business. Then I thought, well, then you put foresight into this little corner, a little specialized unit. Then there is the risk that they are ostracized, which we see in some ministries. We have units like that, but then they're not listened to. So really, you need a combination of the two. You need an established system in a bureaucracy. Actually, you see it works well in companies, but companies have a different mindset in that regard. So you need, let's say, the determination, and it's supported by the leadership. That's really important, because if the boss says, I believe in this, the rest of the house will follow. If the boss doesn't believe in foresight, then the rest of the house will also ignore it. So you say, once a year, we do a foresight process. I mean, it depends on the cycle, really what matters to you. But then you also need to, and this is extremely problematic because it takes a long time, institutionalize critical thinking in the bureaucratic system, which you find in systems like in Finland or in France much more, or the United States, than, for instance, in Germany or Italy, so in some more classical European states. So getting a bureaucracy to be self-critical and to accept dissenting voices, you need flatter hierarchies, because the stiffer the hierarchy, the more the odd voice will be sidelined. And you need to create a special channel, perhaps, which is the norm also in the American State Department. So it's a combination of institutional changes that you can do, bringing people, into a certain unit, but then also mainstreaming it in a way.
Interesting. So far we've been talking about predictive analysis. Katharina, can you describe one or two examples where decision-making process can be established between practitioners and data experts?
Sure. So first of all, I would say that predictive analytics is not enough. From all what you said, Florence, one could get the impression that it's all about the decision makers. They don't want to use data and so on, and it's their responsibility. But I'd say no, it's also in the responsibility of us, the data experts, because we are not used to communicate to decision makers. We think we do some predictive analytics with huge amounts of data and then everything is fine. But nobody is interested in data. People are interested in answers to their questions. And that's why we need to use good communication situation where we need to work out what's the key information in the data, and we need to use visual tools like the one I used, Discovery or other tools, very visual. You have one look at it and you can see within seconds what's happening here, and that's really important. But how can we get together? First of all, we need to communicate. We need to get used to each other and understand what a person means from a very different perspective. And I would like to switch, as you asked for an example, I would like to switch to a very different case or different situation, which was the Debt for Nature deal, the Debt for Nature swap between Portugal and Cape Verde only 3 weeks ago. So there have been deals like that where debt was swapped for the obligation to invest in nature since the 1990s, but the last one was by far the largest. And the idea in itself, it is not so new, the idea to swap debt for the right to use resources to benefit from a certain privilege, for example, to benefit for a geographic position, to build a port somewhere in an African country, or to benefit from resources like minerals, which some call exploitation. But if we change our perspective a little bit, this could perhaps be a model for other countries. It could also be a benefit to have access to the ability of a country to produce ecosystem services like climate protection or like biodiversity, which is very much in accordance with our European values and what we see at the moment, which is really important. And so this could also be an asset, and this is a perfect case for data-informed decision-making and the cooperation between us as the experts on policy making, on ecology and economics, and also data. Because if you want to evaluate ecosystem services, if you want to quantify them, you need data, you need to find the right data, you need models, and then you need a way to monetize them, to bring them into a contract. And this needs agreement to understand what data is useful, what models are useful, and also which countries would perhaps qualify because they could be open to a contract like that. And this is, for me, the perfect example how data-informed decision-making could be implemented in very important global topics, critical topics, and I think this is where the future should go.
Can I add something? I think you are spot on with the communication part, and it's not just you data people; it's also us, the whatever qualitative people, because there is a psychology to giving advice, and I think a lot of people that are in the business of warning, they are in the first of all they have a tendency to catastrophize because they think if I layer it on really thick, then the response will be equally not thick, equally strong. When actually we know from a psychological point of view that the bigger the problem, the less actually the reaction, because you shut down. You call it the Cassandra phenomenon after the Greek figure who warned and wasn't taken seriously. So you can't just, you said they don't want data, they want an answer to their question. I would go even further from a qualitative point of view. They want a solution to their problem. So for a lot of us, we say, hey, oh my God, I see a really big issue coming. Catch. And that's not enough, because if you are in the business of causality, you also need to identify what can you do to either avoid this situation or mitigate the effects. And I think this is the type of well, I'm going to say aftercare that many foresighters don't do. They, stop at warning the decision makers and then are surprised that not much happens. So I think that's a communication issue that we have to completely do homework on as well.
So would you say it's about driving appropriate actions, yeah? Yeah, and then we should go even further, because we should not forget to evaluate those actions, to collect data on what was the outcome of a certain action, and was it really what we predicted with our data?
Yeah.
Would you then say as a foresight analyst that you personally need to go further, or you need to bring on another team who will think about the outcomes of your prediction?
Well, I think, so first of all, foresight is a team sport. Nobody should do it alone, because you bring in too many biases, you name it. But I think in general, so in my own work, but also the teams that I've managed to become better foresighters, I've always pushed them to think further. Okay, now we've identified the problem. what would be levers that decision makers could use to change this problem, avoid it, mitigate the effects, etc., etc. So I think that should be the natural continuation. You can never just analyze the problem. Imagine you're a doctor and you tell your patient, "Oh my God, you have cancer. Deal with it." You know, you have to tell people, "Listen, I've identified a problem. This is what we should do." Oh, these are the options, because decision makers want to choose. You can't be prescriptive about it, but you can lay out the options for them.
Katarina, you've been looking at data for 20 years because you founded your company 20 years ago. Do you feel that more and more policymakers are approaching you and asking you for your insight and input? And have you found the right kinds of ways of communication? How to translate your sometimes complicated data so people like us can understand it?
I think just the fact that we are sitting here together and communicating and obviously understanding each other is a good sign. And yes, I would say there is an increase. It's getting better and better. I mean, we always take the Corona crisis as an example how you should not do it, but I think it was a moment of awakening for many, even in policy making. And yeah, I would say there is still potential, quite a lot of potential to make things better, but we're on a good starting point. We're on a good track.
And from your perspective, now that we've looked at all the data, what can we actually do? I mean, what as a foresight analyst that has looked at the data say, oh, we've been losing Africa for quite some time, not sure we ever had it, right? What can we actually do about it?
So it's very interesting because, well, first of all, this obviously the term "did we lose Africa" implies that we had it at some point, which obviously rings a bit colonial. But I think when you look at the data, that speaks a very clear language and that precedes the war in Ukraine, then you have to ask yourself what has happened actually during that time. And when we look at the data of diplomatic engagement, for instance, we see that Europeans tend to dedicate a lot of time and effort on relations with other Europeans. You know, there are good reasons for that, because history, etc. We don't want to have another world war, so the best way to do that is hang out with each other, build the European Union, etc., etc. But actually, our foreign policy is not nearly as concentrated on Africa as was and is the foreign policy of China and Russia. So you do see, in a way, it actually confirms what we've believed that diplomacy does. It creates relationships. So you need to have more diplomatic engagement. I would say that's the number one thing to do. Here again, speaking of numbers, China has now the second largest diplomatic network in the world. And then a distant third comes France. I mean, number one is obviously the United States. So you do see that the actual size of your diplomatic network plays a role, will have effects. So my first suggestion would be reinforce relations. I think, did you not also use flight data in your pattern?
Yes, that's also really interesting.
Yeah.
Not many people know that there is a huge data set of actual flight movements and also historical flight movements. They are all tracked. You can get them not for free, but you can get them on the internet and then analyze them. And you see the flight movements everywhere around the world. And this could be a really good indicator and seeing, for example, trade relationships or diplomatic relationships, because I mentioned the FDIs, foreign direct investments from China, but this metrics is quite flawed because on the one hand, it could be overestimated. Some people take announcements as a commitment and take it as an FDI, which is clearly not there. And on the other hand, it could be underestimated. Take the example of a Chinese investor owning a Swiss fund that is investing in Africa. You will not see this as a China investment in the official data. But the flight movement is something that's clear that you have. It's publicly documented. And this could be a really interesting source of data. But of course, it's big data and you need to be able to deal with it. You have the right instruments, the right tools.
But
Thank you.
So my number one thing would be more engagement, more connections in all kinds of ways. But then comes the qualitative question, because you also said to me previously, Katharina, that the way African states view China, there are basically essentially two groups, right? So it's not enough to just have, I think you said, one group appreciates that China doesn't interfere, and the other thinks
Yes.
China is a model country,
And
right?
and there is a third group that say, oh, the Chinese influence is bad because they exploit the country. There is a group like that.
So I would say it's not just about engaging activity. You know, it's not enough to just go and say, by the way, we don't like China, you should be with us. It's also qualitative. How do you engage with these states? What is your relationship going to be about? I think what I see behind the scenes in many European capitals is, I'm not going to say reckoning, but a moment of self-reflection on how we have been dealing with Africa. I mean, there is a colonial past, but I think it's not just colonial past. You know, there was, and is to some extent, a normative approach. You know, be more like us, essentially, says European foreign policy. And I think we've now, the market is more competitive, so to speak. You know, we have China, we have Russia that don't make these demands, or, you know, that just don't meddle. You know, you be you, you do you. And I think we're moving in that direction, that we can become more acceptance of the fact that African states might not completely share our body of law or values. That doesn't stop us from cooperating on things like climate change, or, you know, even things like Ukraine. So I think there's this qualitative angle. So not just do more, but also think about what you're actually doing.
So do we need to lower our expectations and ideas, or do we need to make better offers?
I think both. I wouldn't say lower expectation, but I think, you know, if you take this conversation about Africa into the larger context we're living in right now, changing geopolitics, you know, the unhappy title, but the rise of the rest, you know, the fact that the West does not dominate the world anymore. You know, the BRICS, it's an old concept, but essentially we now live almost in the BRICS world. So recognizing that we are one amongst many players means we also have to adapt our behavior. And I think this is, you know, the conversation that in some circles triggers a lot of fear, because we have a feeling of loss. You know, we're losing importance. But I would reframe it. I would say it's not about decline and losing influence. It's about redefining who are we in this new world where everything is changing. You know, it's not just geopolitics. It's also economic patterns. The environment is changing. Demography is changing. You know, digitalization, AI, you name it. Everything is changing. Our descendants will live in a completely different world, and we should think about what's the best case scenario for us, and not spend any time on doom and gloom and, you know, dreaming of, I don't know, a time long gone that we're not going back to anyway.
Okay, so we cannot win anyone back because we never had them.
I always say lead by example. You know, if we are convincing as a model, people will want to emulate us. It's not by telling people you should be more like me that they want to be like you.
And what I take from your data is that there's been a lot of investments from China and Russia over the years and years and years, and it pays off. Have you, by any chance, also looked at official development assistance? Because this is what Europeans always say, but we've been doing so much for so many years, and we're the good guys, basically.
Yes, we have looked at it, and the pattern was not so clear as we hope it would be. But this is the role of data, to have a look at each single point of data, each single indicator, and understand what happens there. This is the first step, to understand what happens. As you spoke about digitization, it's not long ago that there was an article in the Financial Times showing Russian Twitter bots in Africa and how they were distributed. And there is also a correlation with the UN vote. So that is something that happens. But then the question is, why does it happen? We do not know if it's the Russian bots that were the cause for the vote or the cause for a certain political climate in a country. Perhaps the bots were installed because there was a higher chance that they could affect the population's the political climate, because they were already in favor of Russia. We do not know that what is cause and effect. But then after we get a better feeling about what is happening, why is it happening, then we can do the forecast, what is going to happen, what will happen. And then finally, and this is what we ultimately want to reach, is the question, how can we make it happen? And this is where we definitely need the communication between us, the different experts, and discuss what is it? Is it how can we make it happen with development aid? Can we make it happen with trade, with military presence, with the use of digitization? What is it?
You've been following from the EU side basically what the EU has to offer to Africa. would you think that some tools have to be adapted?
I mean, Katharina mentioned it already. Of course, the whole question of climate change is now moving center stage. Uh, until I think before we realized climate change, not we, but the system realized it really had to act also beyond its own borders. It was very much the focus of was development cooperation and was very much Washington consensus. So, like creating liberal markets all around the world. So it was actually not giving the people, on paper things perhaps looked pretty good, but the average people, like Egypt, for instance, in 2010, Egypt was applauded by the IMF for having done all these great reforms. And then later that year, the bubble burst because it didn't trickle down to people. So I think, policies that are for the people, that citizens see the results, see the benefits. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is climate change. I mean, actually turn it around because it actually goes together. Who will feel the effects of climate change are individual people. So I think moving away, again, from that almost 1950s logic of development, we're developing you, and into this mindset of partnership. We have to together tackle climate change. We have to together make sure that you are well equipped to handle the effects, because Africa, even though it almost contributed nothing to CO2 emissions, will be affected disproportionately. So I think all of that means that we're seeing a shift in relation anyway, regardless of the war in Ukraine. Things will have to change.
And as a data analyst, if you had a wish list, or as you were looking for the data for this, at the data for this talk, what data are you missing?
You don't know how much data I saw in preparation. There is a lot of data. The bigger problem is that it's often it's outdated. So it takes a lot of time until we get it. There is no real-time data, which would be really interesting. And also it's not structured. It's a hard work to get the data, bring the data together to make it comparable. I think this is the big problem. And this has to do with people are not used that the data they produce is used by someone else and combined with other data to get the big picture. And this has also to do with data literacy, that I understand what my data can be used for, who will make use of it, and what are the needs of someone who wants to analyze the data and then create forecasts or maybe ideas for action.
Wish list of things that I want. Yeah. Well, I think first of all, we need to be super candid about the fact there's so many things that we don't know. So it's not just data missing, it's just even not understanding certain causalities, like human behavior, for instance, in general. So when it comes to conflict, we now have pretty good databases that can actually, act as early warning systems 3 to 6 months before a conflict breaks out. The problem is the causalities aren't super clear. So we know and we need to know the causalities in order to change the direction. Like, so what can I say, what can I do with a window of 3 to 6 months that doesn't stop, stops this conflict from happening in the first place? So a lot of times it's long-term data, like youth unemployment, food price, etc., that you cannot manipulate easily within 3 to 6 months. So we need to understand better this data that correlates with civil war. How does that actually, how is it explained in causal terms so that we can understand what we can do about it? The second thing is, and that's an even bigger data desert, is interstate war. We're talking about the war in Ukraine, but we know there are different statistical models on interstate wars, depending on how far back you go in history. They all say we had not yet broken the record, right? Because there is this myth of the long peace, and we created this war-free zone in Europe, and never in history. No, actually, there were other times in history when there was peace for 70 years. So we knew that it wasn't improbable, but we have no real data on the conditions under which civil war breaks out. Interstate war. The reasons. There's as I said, data scarcity, because motivations. When will you go into the heads of the likes of Saddam Hussein or even George W. Bush or Putin to find out, can you codify that data set on what got them there? So there's still a lot more to be understood about wars between states. And the problem is, because we have no data, the reflex will always be, or is, essentially we go back to the Cold War theories, like the debate about Ukraine. Is it structuralist? Is it neorealist, et cetera, et cetera? But none of these theories actually can explain what we're seeing fully in the way that Katharina's data can. So more data on anything related to war.
So you've looked at Katharina's data. What kind of predictions can you actually make if we just continue on the same path? What's going to happen? And I'm generalizing in Africa.
So I can't really make a prediction, but I have a question mark about especially the democracy index, because we had a bit of a heyday after 1990s. Actually, since 45, democracy has been the model that's been growing in the world. And now some say it's a plateau, like you. Some see the tip at the end going down. So actually, is it receding? Is it just a bump in the road? Will it stay at this plateau? Does that mean we have reached basically maximum capacity and we'll live in this world of where, roughly more or less the majority of states are democracies, but not all of them are fully established? Or will the journey continue upwards and we'll live in a fully democratic world? That is not a prediction I can make, because this is historically without a precedent. So we don't have data by definition. So I'd have more questions than answers, but I think that will be the determining factor, because it's also in your data set, the way the states that identified as democracies tended to vote along with us in the General Assembly. So the problem is there is no causal relationship between democracy promotion and actually democracy and being institutionalized. So we still have a lot more questions than answers, I'm afraid. But if the journey continues, I said earlier, we live in a high probability world. If we stay on the trajectory that we're on now, it means that, of course, we probably as Europeans, as Westerners, be increasingly isolated in a world where states just don't want to vote with us.
And additionally, the question is, how can we measure democracy? So if you have a look at democracy indices from outside, from experts from outside, you get a different picture than if you ask people in a country, do you think you live in a democracy? What is the extent of democracy? They are correlated, but only to a certain extent. It's just a weak correlation. At least it's a positive correlation. This is one thing. And the other thing is, how is it related to values? We talked a little bit about values, but not going into detail. There are several surveys trying to understand the values in a country, like the World Values Survey, or there's another one, the Hofstadter's Globe. But a lot of this data is just an estimation, and it's estimated by people from United States or from Europe. So we have a projection of European values and European value surveys on African culture, and perhaps they don't fit. Perhaps we need different measures. And if we were able to understand values in other cultures better, maybe that would give us an explanation where is it going. Plus the combination with crisis those countries face as well, which is the climate crisis. If you look at the surveys, you see that there are many people that say, okay, it's getting worse and worse, and it's bringing us into big trouble. And this is something I think this could be an indicator where it goes, and how also what could be an appropriate action from our side.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've scanned so much data. I know we've been talking for weeks preparing for this talk, and I feel like we didn't squeeze all of your knowledge out of it. Is there anything else you would like to share with us at this point?
Well, what I can say, I was really overwhelmed by this huge amount of data. And
can you just name a couple? I mean, because it's not evident to
the viewer
what you looked at.
Afrobarometer, I took the flight data, I took FDI data, I took debt database, the CIPRI database on military investments, some reports that I found from the United States, European Union. I can't mention them all. There was so many. And then also mining data, what is the production of minerals in certain African countries that we had to quantify, monetize them, and then also standardize them on the population, which tells you that you cannot take data as it is. Sometimes you need to standardize it to make it comparable. And all this huge amount of data, this all together, this hopefully can give you a picture. But I think there's even more data out there, and we need to do some more research on that.
Do you know of African institutes that you could work with, or have you looked at them in general that work on data? Or
Oh, it's the same situation as here. So the data is not really used.
But it raised an interesting question, because I've heard this also in the Middle East, North Africa, where people from the region were saying, "Where is the data? We want data in order to understand ourselves better." And here in Europe, I think the relationship with data is always very much about protecting our privacy and things like that. But in the region, governments sometimes withhold data on purpose because they don't want people to know the truth. Like Egypt hasn't released data on youth unemployment or crime rates, for instance, right? So I think obviously we all want more data. I think it will has the potential to help us in a great way. But there are people that are actively not interested for different reasons, for privacy concerns, or for to protect the government's track record. But I think the less data you have, the more problematic it is.
Yeah, and I think we need more positive examples what can be done with data, because with a look at official statistics, we're only used to make use of data as to monitor what has happened in the past, not even what's happening now, but what has happened 1, 2, 3 years ago. And we should make use of data to better understand what can happen in the future. So what are potential developments, especially those that we do not expect, that we do not intend to happen, and to do some more foresight, forecast, scenario analysis. This would be a very good use of data, and it's not done at the moment, not to an extent that we could really show what the value of such data analytics would be.
And I want to advertise your book, actually, Katharina, because I think the fact that many people have no basic literacy on statistics, on probabilities, doesn't make our work easier. We discussed this, probabilities are thrown around like popcorn, and nobody, in the context of Ukraine, how probable is it that Putin will use a nuclear weapon? It's absolutely criminal when people throw around numbers that are basically expressing how they feel about it. But numbers aren't a feeling. I mean, you can use them to express a feeling, but it's not the same as objectively saying, we've gone through a data set with Katharina and this is what we found. So I really want to urge people to get into your book and learn more about statistics.
So sorry, we get carried away with our conversation, but I'm actually going to take a question from the audience. Europe is good at playing the good guy in Africa. However, the voting behavior in the UN is a warning sign that this strategy has failed. Should Europe conditionalize development assistance and learn to play the bad guy? I'm looking in your direction.
Okay, I'm going to say something that might not be popular. But so Europe, yes, Europe has a strong normative international legal approach, not just to Africa in general. This is how we annoy a lot of people, but I think it's also what holds us together. But one thing that has irked many states in Africa, but also in the Middle East, is that we talk about the rule of law and we don't address the elephant in the room. That the invasion of Iraq and the attack on Kosovo, 1999, were both not legally sanctioned. So we are best friends with a hegemon that has broken international law on 2 occasions, and some of us helped. So one thing I've heard when I was in North Africa was, well, how is Ukraine different from Iraq? And of course, we can debate that and say, well, this argument doesn't really work, et cetera, but the thing is that you cannot credibly push international law if you don't defend it everywhere at all times, right? That's the law is the same for everybody, everywhere at all times. It can't be the law, we fight for it when it suits us, but we can turn a blind eye when it doesn't suit us. So I think Europe, if it really wants to be the good guy in the story, it needs to really be consistent with defending international law. If we did that, I think then we would have a lot more support also from African states in the General Assembly.
Do you see any signal that we're going in this direction?
Not yet. We're still all in a deep strategic mental crisis, figuring out where all of this is going. I don't think we're there yet.
I have another question from the audience. And political decision making is not only about data, but about values. Is there a risk of a tyranny of data that dictates political decisions?
Oh, a tyranny of data. I think we're far away from that. I think we should see it as a value that we have data, and at least some of the data is more or less objective and not flawed and not biased and not politically instrumented as so far, so that we have free access to data, more or less free access to data, and that we have the opportunity to analyze the data and to make the results of our analysis public. And this is a sign of freedom and a sign of liberty. This is what I would say as an answer to the question.
Yeah, but I do see the point that there's a danger that data gets manipulated and you use it, to really kind of present the results you want people to believe.
This is why I always insist that data literacy is more about data management, data analytics, and so on, more than a technical issue, more than a skill. It's a mindset, and that mindset includes data ethics. It includes understanding what's in the data, what's not. Do we use data in an ethical way or not? Are we open to findings that contradict our expectations? So this is, and are we more likely to take something as the truth and a result as the truth that is aligned with what we expected from the data? And this is about critical thinking. This is about ethics, and this is an integral part of data literacy as I understand it. And that's also the reason why I work as a volunteer in a working group from IEEE, which is the largest technical organization in the world, on a standard about data and AI literacy, which is exactly about data ethics.
Meaning that people that use data would have to pass an ethics test, or
no? The idea is to derive a framework that could be used for policy interventions and data literacy. So, if we want something like the PISA study for data literacy, so it's comparable over countries, the standard tells what it should include, and that it's not only about, okay, am I able to get some information from the internet, put it into an Excel sheet and do some number crunching? But it's more about, do I understand what's in the data and what not? Where are the limits of the data? Where do I need an expert who helps me understand and interpret the data?
Well, it's very similar to what I recommend about foresight in general. We just need more critical, but not just, we need critical thinking. And the capacity to challenge yourself and to live with the fact that what you have in front of you, information or knowledge, will always only be temporarily true. Right? We don't have absolute truth. Well, this sounds like Trump, but actually what I mean is that we live in a world where, there's progress all the time. New information is coming in all the time. So you cannot get married to your ideas. You need to date them and hold them until you find, actually, I need to change my mind. It's what you said. What do you do when the data tell you something you didn't expect? You need to be able to change your mind when the conditions change. And we all love our ideas because they give us our identity, but we need to be able to, dissociate a little bit from them and be critical, even about what you think yourself.
But, that may be provocative, but isn't it that people are kind of overflooded with information, feel very uncertain about the times we live in, and want simple answers? And isn't it tough to ask for more critical thinking if people want easy answers?
So I think we need...
I'm just challenging you.
Go on, I like it. No, I think people should be aware that just as they don't put anything in their mouths because it's edible, they shouldn't absorb all information that's out there. So we consume, I'm sorry, but shit on the internet all the time. Twitter, Instagram, we read, we have alerts on all the time. There is no need for that. I tell people this, that, for instance, do you really need to see all these horrible pictures coming from war zones, from earthquake zones, etc.? Does that, it makes you feel bad, but does it help the people there that you saw that? No. So you need to have a hygiene or a diet. You need to be fully aware of what information you're absorbing and with what intent. And ultimately, information should lead you to do things in a certain way. They shouldn't just scare you to death. So if you don't want to be scared, if you don't want to live in terror that the world isn't certain, then stop absorbing information in the way you do, and be more mindful about what you're actually looking at. Buy a book, read books. Okay, again, your book, I'm going to get a commission. But, go into depth. That's the beauty of the 21st century, that we eat in crumbs, but actually you could really go into depth with information and really learn about certain things. And there you will feel comfortable and more certain than knowing a little bit about a lot.
Excellent. I mean, this was the last question. The mug goes to Jacob. Thank you very much for your questions. Well, this was a very interesting talk. What do we take away from this? Think critically, use data in a meaningful way, and that we actually have to do something about our engagement in Africa if we don't want to lose them forever. Thank you very much. Thank you.